Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for another one of our Discover Wildlife evenings. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all here. We love doing them for you, and hopefully you enjoy them too. So today we're going to have a fantastic evening. We have got the wonderful Mr. Nick Acheson here, who is going to be share his love and his incredible knowledge for Norfolk. I'm sure many of you are very much aware of who Nick is and are his adoring fans. So, yes, I'm sure he'll be able to delight with all he has to show you. What I will say quickly is that I'm going to let Nick talk, obviously, and at the end, there'll be the opportunity to ask and answer any questions. And we'll also launch a poll, and you can request more information about some of our trips. So if you do have anything that you would like to ask, please feel free to use the Q&A, and there is also the opportunity to send questions over the chat function as well, whichever is easier for you. So please do let us know. But anyway, enough from me. I will introduce you to Nick. It's lovely having him here. I've known him for, well, a long time now, 14 years, I think it is, Nick. Sorry for you've had to be subjected to my company for that amount of time. But anyway, Nick is Mr. Norfolk himself. He probably knows this county better than many other people who would claim to be experts. So, yes. Anyway, so Nick, thanks so much for coming, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Brett, and a very good evening to everybody. Just one tiny bit of housekeeping from me before I start, which is that I work on an extremely ancient map, and it sometimes takes a while to move between slides when I'm working online. So if there's a slight glitch in my PowerPoint, I will keep talking, and I promise that sooner or later we'll move on to the next slide. So forgive me if that does happen. And welcome to my home in Norfolk, which is where I'm sitting this evening. My name is indeed Nick Acheson, and Brett's quite right. I've been leading tours for a long time. In fact, I've been leading tours for 27 years on every continent, though I now only work in the UK. And Brett has joined me first in India on a tour 14 years ago, as he says, and then a couple of years later in Ecuador. And then earlier this year in May, we were on his new home territory in the Highlands of Scotland, and it's always a joy to travel with him. So a little bit about me. I'm a conservationist. I work in nature conservation, principally for Norfolk Wildlife Trust, but I'm also the chair of trustees of the Deepdale Conservation Trust, and there we run the East Anglian curlew head starting project. We also breed the corncrakes, which are reintroduced to the UK, to the fens of Norfolk and surrounding areas, and we have the entire British captive corncrake population producing in excess of 100 birds a year for reintroduction. And I'm also a writer on nature, and some of you have been kind enough to read my book, The Meaning of Geese, and I'm trying very hard this winter to write another book. And in The Meaning of Geese, I cycled during the lockdowns of the winter of 2020 into 21. I cycled 1,200 miles on my mother's, at the time, 42-year-old bicycle around North Norfolk, following the great flocks of pink-footed geese and dark-bellied Brent geese and other scarcer geese which come to Norfolk from the Arctic every year. But this is my home county. Despite having lived all over the world, I grew up in North Norfolk, and it's to North Norfolk that I've returned. So I'll just do a quick roundup of the county, because I'm going to talk you round it in more or less clockwise. If you start in the southwest, south of Swaffham down towards Thetford, and indeed down into Suffolk in the area of Bury St Edmunds, that's what we call the Brecks. And I'll be talking to you first about the wildlife of the Norfolk Brecks. And the Norfolk Brecks features on at least 2 and sometimes 3 of our departures. More on that shortly. And the Brecks is an area of dry grassland. It's essentially the UK's only steppe grassland, with characteristics of Central European steppes and some characteristics actually of Mediterranean grasslands. It's a unique environment with really the hottest, driest summers anywhere in the UK, and yet at the same time capable of experiencing frost any time of year. And that's led to a huge number of species colonizing the Brecks over the thousands of years since the retreat of the Devonian glaciation, which are not found anywhere else in the UK. And some of them are very special indeed, and we visit them on our tours. And then if you move to the west, south of King's Lynn in the area of Downham Market and further west towards March in Cambridgeshire, you have the fens. And this is an entirely different environment, which we visit on a number of our tours. And the fens are peat, essentially. They're the most fertile agricultural soils in the UK because they are historically the floor of a great wetland. And there are four great rivers: the Welland, the Witham, the Nene, and the Ouse, which flow out to sea through the Wash. And one of our tours, Norfolk in late summer, which we run in the very end of the summer or the beginning of autumn, focuses on the exceptional concentrations of wading birds in the Wash. So that's the Brecks in the southwest, the fens to the west of that, which is essentially historically a marshland area, and the Wash coast. And then we have the wonderful North Norfolk coast, which runs right the way, essentially north facing right the way across Norfolk. And this is a highly varied environment of sand dunes, of salt marshes, of coastal shingle, of freshwater grazing marshes, and all of our tours visit various sites along the North Norfolk coast. And then if you spin round the east coast of Norfolk down to the southeast, then you're in the Broads. And the Broads is Britain's most important lowland wetland. It's the confluence of half a dozen great rivers which drain most of Norfolk, and at Great Yarmouth they all flow out to sea. But along the course of these rivers, there are around 40 wetlands, 40 lakes, which are known as the Broads. And these are the home of a great deal of very, very rare and precious wildlife. But we're beginning in the Brecks. And I said to you, the Brecks is a steppe grassland, which is inhabited by many, many creatures which are very, very special. Perhaps the most well-known and the most sought after by our clients is the stone curlew, which we're visit on our summer tour. So we have a tour called Norfolk in early summer, where we visit the Broads, the Brecks, the fens, and indeed the North Norfolk coast. And we see the whole spectacular array of wildlife that we have in our wonderful county. And on our day visiting the Brecks, we always visit Weeting and perhaps one or two other private sites as well, to make sure that we see the extraordinary stone curlew, which is the only member of its family to be found in Northern Europe. And it's very much more of a Southern European species. Many other species, related species, are found in Australia, in Asia, in Africa, and indeed in South America, where there are two species. But we only have this one in Europe. And really, in Norfolk, we're at the northernmost extent of its range. But the Brecks in Norfolk are the heartland of this wonderful species in the UK. And alongside it, we have a nesting population of curlews. We tend to think of the common curlew as a species which nests in moorland in the uplands of the UK. But we do have a small population breeding in the Brecks, and we usually see them at the sites where we visit as well, alongside this species, the lapwing. When Norfolk Wildlife Trust purchased Weeting Heath in the 1940s, it was purchased for its green plovers, which is the lapwing, and for its Norfolk plovers, which is the unique stone curlew. And happily, after dropping to perilously low numbers in the 1990s, we've had an action plan since the year 2000 for the stone curlew, and their numbers have recovered and they're now in fairly good health. Now, in fact, I saw one of these today. I was out taking a friend to see one of these today. Any time from now, on a bright, clear day, such as we had in Norfolk today, if you go to certain woodlands, and we visit woods of this nature in the Brecks in our Norfolk in late winter tour, then you have an excellent chance of seeing the goshawk. Goshawks became effectively extinct as a British breeding bird during the persecution by the Victorians. And like many, many species, polecats, wildcats, pine martins, red kites, buzzards, golden eagles, white-tailed eagles, they were persecuted out of the landscape. Goshawks disappeared altogether, but happily that now they've returned. And the Norfolk Brecks are a real stronghold, although I live in North Norfolk, and just up the road I saw a displaying male today. So on a bright, clear day on our Norfolk in late winter tour, we make sure to visit at least one and sometimes two sites where goshawks are known to display. Now, just to the west of the Norfolk Brecks, as I mentioned, we have the fens, and on our Norfolk in early summer tour, we also visit the wonderful RSPB Lakenheath Fen. Now, this happens to be 50 yards into the county of Suffolk, but I bury my pride because the site is so magnificent. And we cross the border, having visited Weeting Heath, and we pop into Suffolk for half a day. And this is a magnificent site. It's been created out of arable land. It's been reflooded because the Fens is a wetland. It wants to be a wetland. And hundreds of acres of reed beds have been created. And this is a superb site for us to see bearded tits, such as this handsome male here, which is a reed-specific species. In winter, as depicted here, they feed on seeds. In summer, they feed on insects, but they're able to survive on that diet right through the year. They're non-migratory. This is also a brilliant site for seeing bitterns, and our Norfolk in early summer tour coincides with the very best time of year for seeing bitterns. Bitterns are by nature extremely shy. They almost disappeared again from the UK as a breeding bird. They did disappear in the Victorian period, and they almost disappeared for a second time in the 1980s and 1990s when we got down to fewer than a dozen booming males. The males make a magnificent, deep, sonorous booming call to advertise their territory in the spring, and a male can mate with 2, 3 females. Indeed, the record that one male mated with in a single reed bed was 5 individual females. The Lakenheath Fen typically has as many as 14 booming males, and when we visit in early June, then you have a spectacularly good chance of seeing bitterns, because that's the time when they're feeding their chicks. And when they're feeding their chicks, they're simply too busy to be secretive. So they're flying over the reed beds, taking food back to their chicks in the nest. And given that 14 males boom and perhaps as many as 10 females will nest, you've got an excellent chance of seeing bitterns fly over the reed beds. And it's also a superb site for the marsh harrier, yet another bird which the Victorians persecuted out of the British landscape. They became extinct. They began to return at the start of the 20th century. They're still rarer than golden eagles in the British landscape. Still rarer than golden eagles, with about 400 nests in the UK every year. We don't say pairs because, like bitterns, marsh harriers can be polygamous. The males can have more than one female, typically a pair of females, each with their own nest. And he is in charge of doing the hunting, and he brings food back, and he does a wonderful move called a food pass, where he yelps and he calls a female up from the reeds. And that's something that we commonly see on our Norfolk in early summer tour, when we still have chicks in the nest. They tend to fledge in the later part of June, and this is a male marsh harrier. This is a young male marsh harrier. As he ages, he'll get silverier in colour, but we're pretty much guaranteed on any of our tours to see marsh harriers, which of the 400 nests in the UK, about a third of them are here in Norfolk, and increasingly, as our winters get less and less harsh, they winter in considerable numbers. And indeed, the roost at Hickling Broad in the Norfolk Broads can have more than 100 birds coming to roost, but we typically visit smaller roosts which are very close to the wonderful hotel where we stay. Lakenheath is also a superb place for seeing cuckoos. Just arrived when we do our Norfolk in early summer tour, and this, I've never been there in summer and not seen cuckoos. They're really still common, and the same is true of the wonderful hobby, my favorite bird in the whole world. And if you go there in May, you're likely to see flocks of hobbies arriving. Hobbies migrate in flocks. When they arrive, they sometimes bring the much, much rarer red-footed falcon with them. But even come early summer, when we visit for our Norfolk in early summer tour, you're sure to see 2 or 3 pairs of hobbies which breed in poplar plantations on the edge of the marsh. And the poplar plantations were planted in the mid-20th century, and they were intended to be wood for matchsticks, but then the wooden matchstick industry collapsed and the poplar plantations were left all over the lowland East Anglian landscape, and for several years they were nested in by golden orioles, but sadly the golden oriole no longer nests at Lakenheath or indeed in the UK. Now we're moving north again, and we're moving up to the shore of the Wash, and we're moving later in the year as well. Perhaps my favourite, it's hard to say, but perhaps my favourite of all of the Norfolk tours that we run is Norfolk in late summer. And the reason for this is this bird here, who doesn't look like much when he's plonked on the mud just there, but this is a knot. There are two species of knot in the world, the great knot, which is a rare species and sadly a declining species of the Pacific flyway, so breeding in eastern Siberia and going down as far as Australia to winter. But this bird, the red knot, is Holarctic. It breeds right away round the Arctic Circle. And we in northwest Norfolk are on the migratory route of two populations. We have pretty much the whole winter population of birds who nest in Greenland and some of the birds who nest in Canada. And we can have 60, 80,000 knot wintering on the Wash. But also at the peak of their migrations, so in the late summer, early autumn, we receive birds which are going much further south. They come from Siberia and they're heading through the Wash down through Europe and then as far south as southern Africa. And the highest number I've ever seen on a single day with a Wildlife Worldwide group was 160,000 knot. But more on that in just a second. There are plenty of other birds that winter on the Wash. The Wash, equal with Morecambe Bay, is the most important tidal wetland in the UK for wading birds. And there are thousands of curlews, including some of our leg-flagged, head-started curlews from formerly Pensthorpe and now the Deepdale Conservation Trust. And it's a great place for seeing godwits. This is a bar-tailed godwit, and these two are bar-tailed godwits, but typically we'll see flocks of both bar-tailed and black-tailed godwits coming off the Wash to the shelter of the shore when they're pushed off by the highest tides. And there are large numbers of waterfowl here too. There are hundreds and hundreds of shell ducks. Unlike the wading birds, which when the tides are very, very high have to leave the Wash, the ducks, of course, can simply float up, and we see flotillas of shell ducks standing on the mud when we arrive, and then gradually as the tide rises, they just float up onto the higher and higher and higher tides, and then as the tide goes out again, they float back down again onto the mud and begin to feed. But the wading birds, particularly those with shorter legs like the knot, of which there can be up to 160,000 birds, on the very highest spring tides of August, September and October, they are pushed off the Wash, which means they have to find somewhere on land to land, and they really, really, really don't like flying onto land. And so what they do is a compromise. They fly onto gravel pits, which have long been owned and managed by the RSPB. And here they gather in their tens and hundreds of thousands alongside huge numbers of other birds, including the oyster catchers you can see here in the background. This photograph will have been taken in August. In August, we have fewer knot, but there's a greater diversity of birds, and more of the knot are still in their copper breeding plumage. And it's worth noting that should you not be able to make the scheduled departures, these are also tours that we can run as private departures. So should you wish to see the knot spectacular in August or indeed in October, you can book it as a private departure. Indeed, I led a private departure on the 20th and 21st of October, which were the two massive spring tides this year. This is what the knot look like when they come into the pits in September. They've molted out of their spring breeding plumage, and this is how we see them heaving. And amongst them, there will be dunlins. Sometimes there are little stints. There will be, earlier in the season, there'll be curlew sandpipers. Sometimes in August, there'll be white-rumped sandpipers, which is a rare vagrant from North America. There will be bar-tailed and black-tailed godwits. There will be curlews. It really is a spectacle quite unlike any other that you can witness in the UK. And at this time of day, as we go very early in the morning, the spring tides. When I say spring tide, of course, I mean the biggest tide. I don't mean they're happening in the spring, because they're happening in autumn on this tour. But the spring tides happen very early in the morning in the autumn. that makes any sense at all. And this is also the time when the pink-footed geese fly inland. Now, we can't guarantee spectacular numbers of pink-footed geese. The pink feet are very, very variable in the way they behave, depending on how cold it's been, where sugar beet has been planted, how safe, which is what they feed on largely in Norfolk through the winter, how safe they feel on any given roost. Some days they winter in tens of thousands on the Wash, and some days they don't. Whatever you see in terms of pink-footed geese, you'll be thrilled by the sight of them. But I can't guarantee you'll see a flock like this, which is probably 30, 40,000 birds. Although sometimes in winter we do encounter flocks in fields of up to 20,000 birds. Now, we're moving eastwards from the Wash now, along the North Norfolk coast, and all of our tours visit the North Norfolk coast at different times of year for different wildlife. The coast is fantastically varied. It has a range of habitats, including, I'm always very proud as a non-photographer when there's a photo that I took, and this is one of mine. I take lots of photos on my phone of plants, and this is the key plant that makes up our salt marshes. We're the second most important county after Essex for salt marshes, and the commonest of the 4 sea lavender species that we have is this glorious thing. This is common sea lavender, but we also have rarer species, particularly in the drier edges of the salt marshes. This is rock sea lavender, and this beautiful thing is matted sea lavender, which is just about coming into flower in our Norfolk in early summer tour, but is typically about a month later. And matted sea lavender, the only place in the whole of the country where it can be seen is the northwest of Norfolk along the coast. This species is much more widespread. This is the glorious yellow-horned poppy, which is in full flower in our Norfolk in early summer tour, and it's the most charismatic of the species of a rare vegetation called vegetated coastal shingle, which is most well represented along the Norfolk and Suffolk coast. So, for example, if you've been to Minsmere, and I highly recommend our Suffolk coastal tour in early summer, then you'll have seen this species, but it's absolutely symbolic of the Norfolk coast in shingle habitats in early summer. And so too are terns. Wherever there's coastal shingle, we have nesting terns. We have 2 large colonies of sandwich terns. I say we have 2 large colonies. We don't really have 2 large colonies. We have 1 large colony, and it moves between 2 sites. For the last few years, it's been on Scalt Head, which is just to the north of the Burnhams, of Burnham Deepdale and Brancaster. Typically, it will be on Blakeney Point, and where we go to look for terns will depend on where they're nesting that year. This is a sandwich tern, and this is an African migrant species, although increasingly with climate change, a few birds do winter in the UK, particularly on the south coast. But we have the largest colonies in the country of this lovely bird, up to 4,000 pairs on Scalt Head, and they have a wonderful 3-note scratchy call. They arrive typically in March, and it's one of those first signs that spring is coming. But by the time we hold our Norfolk in early summer tour, then they're firmly back on their territories and they're beginning to breed. Probably won't quite be bringing sand eels back to the colony yet, but we certainly see them along the coast. And we see these too. This is slightly earlier in the spring. These are common terns, and you can see here the male is bringing a fish to offer to his female, and that's his way of courting. And that's something that happens in May and June, so we might see this on our Norfolk in early summer tour. And the common tern is a widespread breeding species. We see it both around the coast, right round the coast. It nests wherever there are coastal wetlands, but it also nests inland, and particularly in the Broads where there are floating platforms which have been provided for the terns. We can see them at close quarters. We used not to have this bird as a nesting bird. We have thousands of black-headed gulls nesting, but this is the much scarcer Mediterranean gull. And when I was a boy here in North Norfolk, they were extremely scarce. We would see 1 bird in winter. And now we have several hundred pairs nesting, typically on Scalt, but some years they're also on Blakeney Point, and some years they move also to the Titchwell Reserve. So around the coast we will see them, and we'll also hear their glorious yodeling yelp. It's a most charismatic gull. And we see seals. We very often take a seal trip out towards Blakeney Point. This is a grey seal. The grey seals are pupping exactly now. In fact, the 2nd to 3rd week of November is the peak of grey seals pupping in Norfolk. And we have incomparably more grey seals breeding in Norfolk than we do common seals or harbour seals. The grey seals, we're now probably at 6,000 females giving birth, whereas we've only got a few hundred common seals. But the common seals give birth in summer, and we have a very good chance of seeing both species simply around the coast, or if we take a boat trip out to Blakeney Point or Scalt Head, we have a great chance of seeing them there as well. And when we're out looking for those birds, both indeed in summer and in late summer, when we do the Wader Roost tour, we have a great chance of seeing ringed plovers. Both ringed plovers and little ringed plovers breed in North Norfolk. The ringed plover breeds on coastal shingle, on coastal sand, and is sadly a fast declining bird. The little ringed plover tends to nest on muddy, slightly more freshwater inland sites, so coastal scrapes, for example. They breed at Cly. They also breed in old gravel pits where there are islands or where there's a muddy bank around the gravel pit. In winter, on these shingly, sandy beaches, we look for these. So in our Norfolk in late winter tour, we'll visit the coast, particularly around Holcombe. That's a great, great site for this gorgeous bird. This, of course, is the snow bunting. Like the knot, it's Holarctic. It breeds right the way around the Arctic of Asia, of Europe, of North America. It's one of the most charismatic of the Arctic breeding birds, and we're happy to have flocks of several hundred of them around the Norfolk coast most years. And in most years, we also have these. This is the shorelark. Everywhere else in the world that you see it, and they're very widespread. If you've been on one of our snow leopard tours to Mongolia or to Ladakh, you'll have seen these up in the Asian uplands. If you've been to the northern prairie states of the United States, you'll have seen these birds breeding far, far inland. But in Europe, we know them as coastal tundra breeding birds, and they winter around our coasts, hence the name shorelark. Very few of them winter in total in the UK, but North Norfolk typically has at least one flock. And as most years for the past nearly a decade now, a small flock has come to Holcombe this year. So in our February departure of Norfolk in late winter, when we're between looking for goshawks and woodlarks in the Brecks, we'll go up to the coast in the hope of seeing the gorgeous shorelark. And at that time of year, there'll also be plenty of waterfowl, and late winter is the very best time of year for seeing waterfowl. It's the peak of their displays. The males are in their absolute finest plumage. Here, of course, we have a teal, of which we have tens of thousands wintering around the Norfolk coast, as indeed we do widgeon as well. And right through the winter, we have these, whereas the pink-footed goose that I showed you earlier comes to us from Iceland and increasingly also from Greenland. The population is actually going up exponentially, and the population is spreading into neighbouring Greenland. Whereas they come from the west, the Brent goose, the dark-bellied Brent goose, comes to us from Siberia, from the west of Siberia. And we have tens of thousands of these lovely burbling birds. They have a deep, throaty, burbling call around the coast in winter. And they're joined by just a small number of pale-bellied Brent geese. And they breed on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard. I'm very proud of this photo because it's the only bird photograph in the entire talk that I took myself, and I took it by holding my phone against my telescope because, of course, there's always the chance in our Norfolk in late winter tour, or indeed even on our Norfolk in late summer tour, if one turns up very early, of us bumping into either an Iceland or, in this case, a glaucous gull. And if there is a glaucous gull or an Iceland gull through the winter, typically they'll stick around right through the winter, so we'll know where to go look for them when it comes to our Norfolk in late winter tour. And this is a first winter glaucous gull, so this is a real Arctic breeding species. You'll have seen them if you've been to Greenland, for example. Great big thuggish things, bigger even than a great black-backed gull, magnificent to see on our beaches in winter. And just a little way inland of the coast, there are several charismatic farmland species. All across the UK there are brown hares, but North Norfolk is really one of the very best places for seeing them. You can see dozens of them in a single field. This one is a normal brown hare, but in North Norfolk we have an exceptional variant which has none of the brown in the pelage. The undercoat is white and the guard hairs on the top are black, which gives it this exquisite silver coloration. It looks almost like moonlight, the most beautiful thing. And I see no more than one a year, so we're very, very lucky to see one of them. But whenever I'm looking for hares, I'm looking for the rare Norfolk variant, the silver hare. And wherever I'm looking for hares, I'm also looking for barn owls. And again, North Norfolk is justly famous for the population that we have of the glorious barn owl. They've become less diurnal in recent years, but we do still see them, particularly when we go to raptor roosts, and I'll come on to raptor roosts shortly. Now, we're continuing clockwise around the coast of Norfolk, and we've now reached the southeast of Norfolk. Between Norwich and Yarmouth lies the Broads, and this is, as I say, the confluence of a number of rivers. Going from the northwest, you have the Bure River, the Ant River, the Thurn River, the Trinity Broads, and then going from Norwich, the Wensum, which joins the Yare from the south. The Yare comes to join the Wensum from the south. Then south of that, the Waveney. And those are the rivers which make up Broadland. And because of this massive amount of water, the whole area is very, very waterlogged. And because it's very, very flat, any depression in the ground becomes flooded. So there are huge areas of seasonal marshes. And there are also the Broads themselves. And the Broads are medieval peat diggings, very largely. Some of them are gravel diggings. They've existed for many hundreds of years. They've settled into the landscape and they've become habitat for a huge range of wonderful species. We visit the Broads at any time of year, but particularly on our Norfolk in early summer tour. And one of the key targets will be this glorious creature. We always choose the stillest, warmest day, no matter what the week's weather looks like, because that's the best conditions for seeing the swallowtail. Now, you may well have seen swallowtails all over Europe, and indeed they get as far east as the northwest of India, but this subspecies is found nowhere else on Earth. It's only found in the Norfolk Broads, and it's only found at about a dozen reed bed sites where it feeds as a caterpillar exclusively on a rare reed bed plant species, which is called milk parsley. So we put a great deal of effort into seeing the exquisite swallowtail. We used to put a great deal of effort into seeing this exquisite thing, which is the Norfolk hawker dragonfly. Clues in the name. Until very recently, the Norfolk hawker dragonfly could only really be seen in Norfolk and the extreme north of Suffolk, and it was restricted to the Norfolk Broads and the Broads that are in the extreme northeast of Suffolk. But with climate change, it is spreading extremely fast. It's colonized the whole of the southeast of England. It's colonized most of the south coast. It's now as far west as Dorset. So you can now see Norfolk hawkers pretty much anywhere in southern England, but we're still very proud of them, and we refuse to change the name to green-eyed hawker, which is what they're known as on the continent, and we'll make a great effort to show you them and a number of other specialist dragonfly species of the Norfolk Broads. And I'm a plant geek myself, so I'll put a lot of effort into showing you plants. And when we run at Norfolk in early summer, it's key orchid time. This is one of the very common ones. This is the southern marsh orchid. This one's much scarcer. Again, my photos here. This is the early marsh orchid. We have two different regional forms of this in coastal dunes, such as at Holme Dunes and Holcombe. To a small degree, Holcombe. You can see the coccinia form, which is a gorgeous, deep carmine pink. And this softer pink species is found in freshwater wetlands inland in places such as the Norfolk Broads. And when we're in the Broads, we're also very much focusing on rare vertebrates, including this one here. This is another marsh harrier, but this is a female. And the females are slightly larger, slightly bulkier than the males, and they have this gorgeous contrast between that dark chocolate brown and that beautiful toffee golden head. And they, as I say, they do most of the taking care of the chicks, but the male's job is to hunt for his female if he has just one, or for more than one female and her brood if he has more than one female. And he brings food back, he yelps, and the female flies up in what's called a food pass. And the Broads are also a very special landscape for this bird. This is the common crane, and in the UK in the last 400 years, it's been by no means common at all. the common crane became extinct in the UK in the Middle Ages. They were hunted out. There we have lots of records, unlike storks, for which we have no historical evidence at all. The common crane is mentioned in lots and lots of medieval menus and the lists of what was eaten at banquets. We know that they were common. And both through the drainage of Broadland and the fens, the habitats where they historically nested, and through persecution for food, the crane became extinct 400 years ago. And then in 1979, a pair returned to the Norfolk Broads. They chose the wildest, most forlorn wetland in the whole of the lowland UK. And that pair tried to breed in 1981. They then successfully bred in 1982. And slowly since then, they have been rising in numbers, and pretty much every vagrant crane that's turned up in the UK has ended up joining the flock in the Broads. So we now have two flocks in Norfolk. We have a flock in the fens, which numbers about 70 birds, and we have a flock in the Broads, which numbers 50 or 60 birds. And in addition, 90-something birds were released into Somerset, and they've colonised both Gloucestershire and Somerset and various other parts of the southwest. And indeed, birds from the southwest have now joined the flock in the fens. So there's gene flow between the reintroduced birds in the southwest and the pure wild birds which have colonised East Anglia. And we now have more than 70 pairs of cranes nesting in the UK every year. But Broadland remains the absolute heartland for the common crane, and we typically see it on the day that we spend in the Broads on our Norfolk in early summer tour, but we might see it around the coast at any time of year because they're no longer such an exceptionally rare bird of the Broads that you have to go and see exclusively in the Broads. Now, the final habitat I'm going to touch on is heathland, and there's a very good reason for this. Our hotel, in which we stay for all three of these departures, is based just outside the town of King's Lynn. King's Lynn is a very beautiful medieval town with a huge history, well worth a visit in its own right. If you're coming to Norfolk, give yourselves an extra day because there's tremendous history to explore in King's Lynn. But just either side of our hotel are two national nature reserves, and they are heathland national nature reserves. And more than just being extensive areas of heathland, they're also wet heaths. So you can see this species. This is the heather that likes wet areas. This is called cross-leaved heath. And these two wet heaths have a wonderful diversity of species. There are plenty of birds, including woodlarks, including tree pipits, including this lovely stonechat. In summer, also nightjars. Goshawk nests on one of them and sometimes can be seen displaying over the other. Woodlark here you can see, and this is a bird that we see year round on our tours, 5 minutes from our hotel, but particularly the best time of year for hearing them singing is our Norfolk in late winter tour in February. But we typically, if we get up early enough, and it's easy to do because our hotel is right next door to these two heaths, we'll hear them singing even right into the summer because they breed twice in the season. But the main reason that I chose that hotel for our Norfolk tours is that in winter, there are raptor roosts on both of those wet heaths. We see merlin, we see short-eared owl, we see kites, we see buzzards, we see peregrines sometimes, we see lots of marsh harriers, and we always also see hen harriers. So the reason for being right next door is to be able to go out in summer to listen for nightjars and displaying woodcock, which are very, very easy on both of the heaths either side of our hotel. But also in winter, we're able to nip out just before dinner at dusk, and we spend an hour in the cold and we see the birds that come into the roost, and we are almost guaranteed to be able to show you a hen harrier such as this magnificent bird right here. And that's the point at which I'm going to pass back to Brett to explain to you how our offers work and also to field any questions, which I'll be delighted to answer if anyone has any. Please ask away.
So thank you so much, Nick. That was fantastic.
Well,
So
I'm
lovely.
extremely pleased that my computer didn't glitch and we didn't have any
No,
problems whatsoever. So my evening's made.
I didn't see any freezing whatsoever. So
No.
it's a very successful evening indeed. So yeah, absolutely. We have a Q&A session. So if you would like to ask us a question, please do. And I will pose that to Nick. There's also a chat function as well. So if you'd like to ask a question in there, then I'll do that. I'm just about to launch a poll. It should be able to go here. So hang on a second.
I'm just going to answer a couple of questions that are in the chat, Brett, if that's all right.
Go for it. Please
First
do.
of all, to my very dear friends, the Cottises, and your friends, the Cottises, a very
Yes,
warm
indeed.
hello from Norfolk and where Brett is in Hampshire. Hello, the Cottises. Our best wishes to Wilbur. Malcolm Stoker, how much scope is there for photography? That's a fine question. On the Norfolk in late summer tour, the one where we visit the Wash and you have the enormous swirling flocks of waders, there is tremendous scope for photography. Absolutely tremendous. It's extraordinary. You have these huge flocks, and we go twice. We make the point of getting up super early, 5:30, to go twice for dawn, because each day it's different depending on. One year I was standing there and a white-tailed eagle tipped up, and that stirs up all of the flocks of birds, and another day there'll be a peregrine shoot past, or sometimes up to 3 peregrines, and they swirl the flocks, and then a short-eared owl will go through and put the birds up from the pits. So yes, tremendous photographic opportunities on the Norfolk in late summer tour. Norfolk in early summer, yes, definitely. We spend a lot of time going very carefully through every habitat. So there are lots of opportunities to take photographs of insects, flowers, landscapes. You will have the opportunity to take photographs of birds such as we see, but unlike some, for example, Brett leads wonderful photographic departures where you focus on particular hides for particular organisms like wolverine or like Arctic fox or whatever species you're going after. We don't do that on the Norfolk tours. That said, were you to wish to have a tailor-made departure for any of those species, we could arrange it. But for photography on the general tours, yes, definitely. I'd say that Norfolk in late winter is probably the one with fewest opportunities, and yet we commonly see species like firecrest singing or hawfinch feeding on the ground. So there are still photographic opportunities, but 100% photography on the Norfolk in late summer, which is the one where we focus on the massive flocks of waders on the Wash, and Norfolk in early summer, where we focus on all of the wildlife on all of the habitats that we visit. And we visit the Broads, we visit the Brecks, we visit the coast, we visit the fens. You get the whole flavour of Norfolk's most amazing habitats.
Very, very thorough indeed. Thanks, Nick. That's great. For some reason, I can't get the poll to work, so unfortunately, that will be passed on this evening. It's just not instigating for whatever reason. So, yes, we'll move on. We've got a few questions. One's from Barry, who's asked whether there is a chance to see goshawks on the trip at the end of May. I think it is the late summer trip, early summer. Is it that one?
So yeah, typically the beginning of June. Barry. Yes, but it's not a species that we look for. So goshawk has now become so much more common in Norfolk that we bump into them.
Okay, yeah.
However, we don't go looking for goshawk, and you've got simply to be lucky. So we have 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It's the slightly further one away from our hotel, one of the National Nature Reserve heaths that we visit, where we go to look for woodlark, where we go to look for nightjar, where we go to look for woodcock, and plants like sundews and cranberries and all sorts of interesting things. Goshawk nests there. So there's always a chance of bumping into a goshawk. But if goshawk is your key priority, then Norfolk in late winter is the tour, because that's the one when they're displaying. Goshawks display from now. I saw my first displaying one of the winter today, until really the late February. And the key to looking for goshawk is to choose a bright, clear day, and then only go. Raptors, birds of prey, are really lazy, and they don't get up until the thermals get up. So you don't go looking for them displaying until after the thermals. So the goshawks began today at 11 o'clock. So
Perfect.
goshawk is a nice late morning sort of a species.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Nick. I've got a couple of questions from Janice, so I might as well sort of merge the two together. The first part of the question is, do you do any trips as well on our trips to the Stubmill Raptor Roost? Do we visit?
No. The
Okay,
reason being that we visit Hickling on our tours. We only visit Hickling in Norfolk in early summer,
right.
and Hickling is more than an hour from our hotel, and so we go to raptor roosts close to our hotel,
Okay.
so you can see the same range of species. You won't see as many marsh harriers as you will do at Stub, where at Stub you can get more than 100. Typically it's 50 or so, but the highest count ever was 113 birds, I believe. So we go to raptor roosts close to our hotel for the reason that in winter, when raptors are coming to big roosts of that nature, you really don't want to be driving long distance in the dark, in the wet,
Yeah,
etc.
makes perfect sense. And then Janice's next question, which sort of lumped together, is: are there any pelagic trips as part of this?
Not pelagic for birds, no. And in fact, friends of mine have been trying to do late summer pelagics,
Yeah.
and really so far no real success in terms
Okay.
of, not like the Scillies, for example, where they're seeing outrageous flocks of Greyton, Corries, shearwaters, and Scopoles shearwaters, and Sabines gulls, and Wilson storm petrels, and everybody else. So
Yeah.
no, but we do typically, we don't always guarantee it, because I do what's best for the wildlife, not what's in the itinerary, if you get what
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah. Of course.
But mostly on our Norfolk in early summer, we do take a boat trip, and that boat trip takes us around Blakeney Point, and then we see the terns and the gulls and the seals.
Yeah.
But that's the only boating that we do.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully that is helpful. Um, we then got a question from Daniel, who I actually know from a previous tour. So hi, Daniel. Is there any chance to see otters on any of these tours?
Yes. um, so particularly Norfolk in late winter, we go to
Okay.
the Brecks, and that's a great place in late winter for otters. Otters, I don't know how much you know about them, Daniel, but otters are quite fickle. In up where Brett has been living for the last few years in the Highlands, you sort of go to the right habitat and eventually you'll find an otter. But in the lowlands, the visibility of otters tends to depend on there being a female with teenage young. And they become very reliable and observable when there's a female with teenage young. And the females are typically accompanied by their young for a year and a half or so. And at the stage between a year and a half, the mums are really a bit bored of the young, and the young are crashing around in the water. And that's when they become very, very visible. So if we know of a place where there are reliable otters, and the last observable site for lesser spotted woodpecker in Norfolk is a very good otter site. It's also a superb site for mandarin ducks and for siskins and lesser redpolls, and bramblings, and woodlark actually, and crossbills. But as we're along the river there, if we managed this year, it was actually heavily flooded and we weren't able to walk along the riverbank. But when we typically do so, then we do have a fairly good chance of seeing otter. And nowadays, happily, otter is now in every river system in Norfolk. They're in every mainland county of Britain now. The only county they're not in is the Isle of Wight. So we're happy to have otters everywhere. And we do now bump into otters. So, for example, I bump into otters at Cley, and I bump into otters in the Broads. So, yes, there's always a chance. But Norfolk in late winter has your highest chance, because we're really in good otter habitat at a good otter time of year.
Perfect. I don't think we have any more questions. Oh no, there we have. Literally one just came in. It's when's the best, basically give advice on when the best chance to see pink-footed geese in numbers is.
Ah, that is a very fine question. Now, In fact, pink-footed geese, we don't do any of our tours at their best time of year, I'm afraid. They come in September, and how many come depends on how cold it is and how much food's available. The peak for pink-footed geese, and again, we can provide this, but the peak for pink-footed geese is really December and the first half of January. So we're going into peak pink-footed goose. So when we get flocks of last winter through December, at Holcombe, we had a roost of 90,000 birds. And that happens in December. And really, it's by mid-January, they're already beginning to go north. And by mid-February, they've gone.
Yeah. Okay.
And they typically don't build up to the really big numbers until at least late November. So really December, early January is your best time for massive spectacles of pink-footed geese. And we don't, it's tricky when you're running scheduled departures, you can't tick all of the boxes. It just doesn't work. So we do see pink-footed geese coming off the wash on our Norfolk in late summer, on the one where we go for the wading birds, and we can see thousands. Some years there'll be a big roost there, and some years we'll just see a small number. This year in September and October, when I led the private tour, we saw a few thousand.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Nick. So I haven't got any more questions at the moment. So if anybody wants to ask anything, now is the time. But what I can say quickly is obviously you can order our brochures online, as you can see on screen. So please head to the website if you would like to do that. We're also offering an exclusive discount for joining this talk. For £50 off for one of our Norfolk holidays with the Mr. Nick Acheson. And there is a little code to use, which is NOF Zoom, NOF Zoom. So please, if you are interested in making a booking on one of our group tours, then please do quote that and you can get your £50 off. And then a little bit more is that I'm doing a talk on Thursday this week about Svalbard. So if you fancy escaping the cold of winter in the UK and go somewhere even colder in summer in Svalbard, well, in early summer, it's actually still winter really, to be honest, because it's May. I'm taking you on a small ship voyage to Svalbard on Thursday night at 7:30. So do join me. Then there is next week, I think it is on the 2nd of December, there is another talk. It says it's with me. It's not. It's actually with a Mr. Chris Breen. I could talk about Zambia. I was there only yesterday, or day before yesterday. So, but on this occasion, it's Mr. Breen, I'm afraid, who I'm sure will look after you wonderfully and fill you in with all sorts of fascinating information about walking safaris in Zambia. So if either of those are of interest to you, please do tune in. And yeah, more than anything, I would just like to say a massive thank you to Nick for his time, his enthusiasm, and more than anything, his incredible knowledge. So thank you, Nick, for coming. It was wonderful to have you and lovely to see you too.
Well, I look forward to seeing lots of people who've been with us this evening in Norfolk, and come visit Brett. We'd love to see you in Norfolk. Thanks everybody for listening. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, everybody. Good night. Thanks, Nick, again.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.